Sometimes the harshest deserts are not made of sand and stone, but of silence, fear, and the loneliness carried inside the heart. This is the story of a young woman who dared to step beyond the walls that confined her, only to find cruelty waiting in the shadows. Yet, when all seemed lost, a figure rose from the wild, silent, unyielding, and stronger than the canyon walls themselves. What began as terror would turn into a bond neither of them expected, a fragile thread of trust woven in the dust of the Old West. And from that trust, something even greater would grow: healing, love, and the courage to begin again. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Late afternoon, the sun bled through a veil of dust that shimmered across the land like a faded curtain. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled over hard-packed earth, raising little clouds that clung to the hems of Eleanor Hartwell's prairie dress. She held her bonnet with one hand and gripped the side of the buckboard with the other, her eyes sweeping over the vast, red-dusted wilderness. The land stretched endlessly, mesas and cliffs glowing under the sun's last fire, shadows spilling long across the desert floor. A raven circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely, and Eleanor felt both exhilarated and uneasy. She had begged for this freedom, begged her father to let her see beyond the ornate walls of their estate in Santa Fe. At 28, she could no longer bear being treated like a fragile doll locked away in a cabinet. Jonathan Hartwell, proud rancher and land baron, never saw her as more than his daughter, a name to guard, a reputation to shield. Yet Eleanor craved more. She wanted dust in her lungs, wind in her hair, a story carved into her own hands, not inherited from her family name. The three men who offered to guide her deeper into the territory had seemed trustworthy enough at first. Wade, their leader, had streaks of gray in his beard and a smile that might have been called charming in a gentler place. Coulter and Briggs, his companions, spoke little but carried her belongings with surprising ease. Their boots thudded against the earth, their eyes glinting with something she hadn't yet named. The road narrowed as they turned from the main trail. Eleanor felt a prickle beneath her skin. "Is this the survey path?" she asked, her voice careful, steady. "A shortcut." Wade replied without looking back, the reins loose in his hands. "You'll like it. Fewer rocks, better views." Coulter chuckled, a sound low and unpleasant. Eleanor tightened her grip on the buckboard's rail. She had been raised to maintain composure, even under scrutiny, even in fear. Her father's lessons, though harsh, had carved steel into her backbone. Still, a cold weight settled in her stomach. There were no markers here, no signs of ranch hands, no watering troughs or tracks, only silence, heavy and watchful. The wagon climbed into a narrow canyon, its walls rising steep and unforgiving on either side. The sun dipped lower, painting the cliffs with fire, but beneath that beauty lurked something suffocating. Eleanor recognized the shape from her sketchbook. This was a box canyon. One way in, one way out. She stood, skirts rustling. "I believe we've gone far enough." The horses slowed as Wade pulled the reins tight. He climbed down slowly, stretching as though easing stiff joints before work. "Oh no. Miss Hartwell," he said, voice smooth but lined with menace. "We're just getting started." Coulter hopped down beside him, wiping his palms on his trousers. Briggs stayed seated, but his grin widened, teeth flashing in the dusky light. Eleanor's spine straightened. "Take me back," she demanded, her tone clipped and formal. Wade tilted his head. "Don't reckon we owe you courtesy." He moved with sudden speed, far too quick for his years, and seized her wrist. Eleanor's breath hitched, but she did not falter. She swung her free hand and slapped him hard across the face. The sound cracked against the canyon walls. His smile broke. The mask of civility fell away, leaving only something coarse, hungry, and cruel. With a yank, he pulled her from the wagon bed, her boots scraping rock as she stumbled. Coulter and Briggs circled her like vultures. Coulter's eyes gleamed, sharp and mocking. Briggs spat into the dirt and smirked. Eleanor fought like fury. She drove her elbow into Coulter's chin, drawing a grunt. She raked her nails across Wade's cheek, leaving red lines. She kicked Briggs hard in the shin. For a moment, pride flared. She was no fragile doll, but 3 men against 1 was never fair. Someone shoved her hard, and her knees cracked against stone. Pain shot up her legs. She gasped, her corset pulling tight. But before she could rise, Coulter pinned her shoulders. Briggs straddled her legs, his fingers fumbling clumsily at the buttons of her bodice. "No," Eleanor snarled, twisting, biting. Her teeth sank into flesh. Briggs yelped and staggered back, clutching his hand, blood beading bright in the fading light. Eleanor scrambled up, dress torn at the collar, dust stinging her throat. She ran, her boots setted over loose rock, her breath tearing ragged from her chest. The canyon spun into blurs of shadow and crimson. She didn't know where she was going, only away. Away from their laughter, their hands, their stink of sweat and whiskey. Brush tore her arms, thorns scratching her skin, but she pushed forward, her bonnet ripped away, blonde hair tumbling loose behind her. The world narrowed to the pounding of her heart and the rasp of air in her lungs. Then she saw him. At the crest of a rise stood a figure, tall and still against the molten horizon. His outline was sharp, unmoving, carved from the same stone as the cliffs. For a heartbeat, Eleanor thought it was another trap, another predator, but something in his stance held different weight. He was anchored, rooted, as though the land itself had shaped him. The bow slung across his back gleamed faintly in the last of the sunlight. His long braids shifted in the wind. His eyes, dark and unreadable, caught hers even from a distance. Eleanor's legs gave out. She stumbled forward, gasping. "Help me," she whispered, voice breaking against the canyon walls. Then the world tilted, and everything went black. Evening settled slowly, the kind of dusky blue that turned canyon walls into looming shadows. A fire crackled low near the bend of a stream, its smoke curling into the cooling air with the scent of mesquite. Eleanor stirred, her body heavy, her mouth dry as stone. For a moment she could not place herself. Her cheek rested against something soft. Bundles of dried grass laid neatly as bedding. A coarse wool blanket covered her shoulders, far too large for her, smelling faintly of smoke and leather. Her eyes blinked open to the wavering firelight. Across the flames sat the man she had glimpsed on the ridge. He moved with measured patience, a long flint blade in his hand, its edge catching sparks as he sharpened it against stone. His posture was upright, deliberate, every gesture economical. The bow she had seen earlier lay within reach, along with a quiver of arrows and a pouch of sinew cords. Eleanor tried to sit, her ribs aching, her throat raw. The blanket slid from her shoulders. She gasped softly, startled to find her blouse covered by a clean, oversized shirt. The sleeves rolled up to her elbows. It was not hers. Her bodice beneath lay torn, the corset laces snapped, but someone had taken the care to cover her modestly. "You," her voice cracked into a whisper. "You help me." The man's eyes lifted briefly, dark and unreadable, before returning to his blade. He gave the smallest of nods. Why, she asked, clutching the blanket tighter around herself. His reply came after a long silence, his voice low, steady, almost part of the wind itself. "You were not theirs to take." The words struck her more sharply than the canyon air, simple, unadorned, but full of a quiet certainty that made her throat tighten. It was then she noticed the shapes beyond the firelight, 3 men sprawled against the dirt, wrists and ankles bound tight with rawhide. Wade, Coulter, and Briggs. Their faces were swollen with bruises, lips split, one of them groaning faintly in his sleep. Eleanor's stomach lurched. He had spared them, though every mark on their bodies told her they had felt the weight of his fury. "You didn't kill them." His gaze flicked to hers, hard as flint. "They'll wish I had." She shivered, not from fear of him, but from the truth of the desert night closing in. The canyon around them was silent but for the trickle of water and the restless crack of fire. Drawing the blanket close, Eleanor studied him. He seemed carved from the land itself, broad-shouldered, his skin bronzed by sun and wind, black braids framing a face that carried both strength and sorrow. Scars cut faint lines across his forearm, evidence of battles long past. Yet there was a calmness in him, like stone that had withstood storms. "I am Eleanor Hartwell," she whispered, though her voice trembled at the absurdity of manners in such a place. The man's head dipped once. Kael Taza. His name seemed to hang in the air, resonant, a sound as solid as the ground beneath them. For a while neither spoke. The fire filled the silence, spitting sparks that floated upward before vanishing into the night sky. Eleanor listened to the water running nearby, to the occasional groan of her captors bound in pain, and to the steady rhythm of Kael's knife against stone. Strangely, none of it frightened her as much as the thought of being alone again. Finally, she asked, "What will you do with them at dawn?" "I'll take you back to the road. Leave them for the army patrols." She nodded slowly. There was nothing else to say. Her hands trembled beneath the blanket, not from the chill, but from the weight of what had nearly happened. She had faced danger before in whispers, in her father's controlling voice, in the stifling halls of the Hartwell estate, but never had she seen the raw cruelty of men laid bare, and never had she felt so suddenly, fiercely alive. Kael set the blade aside and stirred the fire with a stick. Sparks leapt, reflecting in his eyes. Eleanor drew her knees close, resting her chin atop them, and for the first time that day allowed herself to breathe slowly. "You saved my life," she murmured. He said nothing, only glanced toward her briefly, then back to the flames. That glance, fleeting as it was, stirred something unfamiliar in her chest. It was not comfort, not yet, but a recognition like two paths crossing in the wilderness, neither expecting the other, yet both changed by the meeting. Later, under stars sharper than glass, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the canyon breathe. Kael sat not far from her, still as a sentinel. The three men groaned occasionally in their bonds, but she no longer feared them. What unsettled her now was the strange clarity that pulsed in her veins. She had left Santa Fe to prove she was no fragile ornament. The desert had tested her, broken her pride, but in the silence beside this man, she felt the faint stirrings of something stronger, an ember not yet named. She closed her eyes, her whisper carried on the night wind. That was enough. Kael's head turned slightly, though he did not answer. His gaze lingered on the fire until dawn's first pale light touched the canyon walls. Dawn crept slowly into the canyon, its light timid at first, brushing the cliff walls with strokes of gray and indigo before blooming into soft gold. Eleanor woke to the faint warmth of the fire Kael had coaxed back to life, the scent of smoke mingling with the sharp, clean air of morning. For a moment, she lay still, listening the trickle of water over stones, the distant call of a raven, the groan of one of the bound men shifting in his ropes. Kael knelt by the fire, feeding it with twigs, his movements deliberate, as if each gesture carried weight. His braid swung forward as he bent low, his breath steadying the flame. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter, her body stiff with bruises, her mind still heavy with fragments of the night before. When he noticed her stirring, Kael reached for a small tin cup resting on a rock near the fire. He filled it with water, warm by the flames, dropping a sprig of wild mint into it. Without ceremony, he extended the cup toward her. Eleanor accepted it with both hands, surprised by the tremor in her own fingers. She raised it to her lips. The taste was simple, almost startling, a hint of mint cutting through the metallic tang of tin and smoke. It wasn't china. It wasn't silver-rimmed tea in her father's parlor. Yet the comfort it brought was so sudden that tears welled in her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered. Kael gave a single nod. They did not speak further. Words seemed unnecessary in the canyon's silence, where the land itself filled the air with its vast presence. When Eleanor tried to stand, her knees buckled. Kael rose instantly, catching her elbow with a strong, steady hand. His touch was not rough, not lingering, simply firm enough to hold her upright. "We must go," he said. His voice carried no softness, yet it was not unkind. She glanced toward the three men still bound, their faces battered, their clothes torn. A shudder passed through her. She would not ask about them again. Some things were best left to the desert. They set out on foot, Kael leading, Eleanor following close behind. The canyon walls towered above them, catching the newborn light, glowing amber as though the cliffs themselves breathed fire. Eleanor stumbled often, her boots slipping on loose shale, but she pressed on, unwilling to show weakness. Kael walked with the sureness of someone who belonged to this land. Every few steps he paused, not aimlessly, but to read the world around them. At one point, he knelt beside a cluster of tracks in the dust. "Coyote," he said simply. Later, a scorpion crawled across the trail, its tail curved like a drawn bow. Eleanor froze, fear prickling her skin, but Kael merely stooped, brushing the creature aside with a stick, letting it vanish into the scrub unharmed. "You could have killed it," she murmured. His reply was plain. It was not hunting us. The words lingered in her chest long after they moved on. Hours passed beneath the hardening sun. Eleanor's blouse, still covered by the shirt he had given her, clung to her skin with sweat. The corset beneath pinched and rubbed where it had torn. Every step a reminder of her ordeal. Yet she did not complain. Something in Kyle silence compelled her to endure, to match his quiet strength as best she could. When at last they paused in the shade of a mesquite, Kyle handed her a strip of dried venison from his pouch. Eleanor accepted it awkwardly, chewing slowly. The flavor smoky, foreign yet nourishing. She watched him as he sat across from her, eating sparingly, his eyes scanning the ridges as if listening for things she could not hear. Gathering courage, she broke the silence. "Why are you alone out here?" Kyle's gaze flicked toward her, then away. For a long time he said nothing. She thought he would ignore her, that her question had overstepped the fragile line of trust between them. But at last his voice came, low, threaded with something unspoken. "The army took my brother. Then they took my land. A treaty took the rest." Eleanor's breath caught. She wanted to say she was sorry, but the words felt thin, useless against the weight of what he had shared. She lowered her eyes, staring at the dust between them. I know what it is to have something taken." "Not the same, but," she faltered, her throat tightening. "My father keeps me locked away, as if I were another piece of his property to protect or to control." Cale studied her for a long moment. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet recognition. "Yet you left," he said. "Yes," she answered, almost defiantly. "I wanted to see the land for myself. I wanted to know if I could survive it. And now you know." She met his eyes then, the first true meeting between them since the canyon. In his gaze she saw no mockery, no scorn, only a steadiness that unnerved her more than cruelty ever could. She felt exposed, yet also strangely safe, as though the desert itself had granted her permission to speak plainly. The wind rose, carrying with it the dry scent of sage. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. She thought of the parlor in Santa Fe, of polished floors and shuttered windows, of her father's voice sharp with command. Then she thought of this place of dust on her skin, of blood dried on her hands, of the man before her who spoke so little yet carried entire histories in his silence. When she opened her eyes again, she whispered, "I would rather be here, bruised and torn, than safe behind his walls." Kyle did not smile, but something shifted in his shoulders, a barely perceptible loosening. He rose, brushing dust from his trousers. "We move," he said, and so they did. By midday, they crested a ridge. From its summit, Eleanor could see the main road stretching far below like a pale ribbon across the flats. In the distance, faint smoke curled skyward, perhaps from a ranch or an outpost. Civilization waited. She stopped, turning to face him. Her chest ached with exhaustion. Her lips cracked from dryness, yet her voice was steady. "Thank you for everything." Kyle looked at her, then really looked. His eyes, deep as the shadowed canyons, held something she could not name. "You owe me nothing," he said, but Eleanor shook her head. "I do." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind. At last, Kyle turned away, leading her down the trail. Still, the echo of her words clung to the air, carried on the dust, lingering like the beginning of something neither of them could yet admit. The ride back into Santa Fe should have felt like salvation, yet Eleanor's chest grew heavier with each mile. The stagecoach driver never questioned her torn blouse, her dust-stained skin, or the blank look she wore like armor. That was the way of the frontier men minded their own business, especially when silence clung to a woman like a shroud. The adobe walls of the city rose pale against the desert sky, and as they rattled into the cobbled courtyard of her father's estate, Eleanor felt a different kind of prison door slam shut inside her. Jonathan Hartwell stood at the entrance, his mustache bristling, his hands fisted at his sides. He looked less like a father and more like a judge awaiting a guilty verdict. Servants gathered in the shadows, their whispers carried by the wind. "You are lucky to be alive," Jonathan said as soon as she stepped down. His voice was controlled, but the tremor beneath it betrayed fury. God only knows what could have happened. Eleanor lifted her chin, dust streaking her cheeks. It did happen, she said quietly. Jonathan's eyes darkened. You will never leave this city again, not without armed escort. I am not a child. You are a Hartwell. That is more important. She met his glare with a steadiness he had never seen in her before. The canyon had hardened her, and she no longer bowed to his thunder. Is it? The question landed between them like a thrown stone. Jonathan clenched his jaw, too enraged to answer. He gestured sharply to a servant. See her to her room. She will remain there until I decide otherwise. And so Eleanor was locked away again, the shutters nailed closed. Meals slid through the door like offerings to a prisoner. Her dresses were removed, her boots hidden. It was not punishment, it was erasure. But outside those walls, Santa Fe buzzed with rumors. At the saloon, men leaned over whiskey glasses and whispered about the Hartwell girl found wandering the desert. Her clothes torn, her life spared by the hand of an Apache warrior. Some said the warrior had claimed her. Others said she had run off willingly. Every version grew wilder in the telling. By the third day, the tale had reached the ears of cattlemen, merchants, even the clergy. Jonathan raged at the gossip, but could not silence it. The more he tried, the more the story took root. Meanwhile, far beyond the city, Kyle Taza returned to the canyon where the fire had burned low and the three men lay bound for the patrols. They were gone now, dragged away by soldiers, leaving only rope fragments in the dust. Kale ignored them. His eyes searched for something else. Near the bed of dried grass where Eleanor had slept, he found it a small silver locket, half buried in the dirt. Its chain was snapped, its surface scratched. But when he pried it open, a faded sketch lay inside. The likeness of a woman, eyes soft and kind, features delicate in a way Eleanor's echoed. Her mother, perhaps. Kale closed the locket, running his thumb over the initials engraved faintly on the back, E.H. He slipped it into the small pouch at his belt. It was not theft. It was a tether, something left behind that told him her presence in this land had not been a dream. The canyon was quiet, but it remembered. Kale sat where Eleanor had sat by the fire, listening to the silence, holding the locket in his palm. He could still hear her voice, fragile yet fierce. I would rather be here, bruised and torn, than safe behind his walls. Back at the Hartwell estate, Eleanor traced invisible lines across the glass of her shuttered window. Beyond it lay the hills golden under the late afternoon sun, whispering of freedom. In her lap rested a folded scrap of parchment, a letter she had written to herself the night before, words she dared not send. It spoke of the canyon, of the firelight, of a man who said little but carried truth in every movement. She pressed the letter to her chest, wishing the walls would crumble. Her governess, Madame Lisette, entered quietly with supper. The older woman avoided Eleanor's eyes, but as she set down the tray, she slipped a whisper. They speak of you at the saloon. They say a warrior saved you. Is it true? Eleanor's throat tightened. She longed to speak, to claim the truth boldly, but fear of her father's wrath sealed her lips. She only nodded once. Lisette gave the faintest of smiles before retreating. That night, Eleanor dreamed of firelight again, of Kyle's profile cut sharp against the flames, of the way he had brushed aside a scorpion instead of killing it. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a hollow ache in her chest. Jonathan stormed into her chamber at dawn 2 days later. His coat was unbuttoned, his tie loose, his revolver at his side. His eyes burned with sleepless fury. "You think I wouldn't watch you," he hissed. "After what you did, the shame you've brought on this house, I didn't bring shame," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling but clear. "I survived." "Survived what?" His voice cracked like a whip. "You won't even tell me the full story. You left with men we didn't hire, vanished. And now you speak of going back, to whom? A savage." The word cut her like a blade. "His name is Kale," she whispered. Jonathan's face hardened. "You are my daughter. You will remember what that means." "It means nothing," Eleanor said, "if I am a prisoner in your house." Jonathan's hand tightened on the revolver, then fell away. He turned on his heel, slamming the door, locking it once more, and miles away. Kyle sat beneath the cliffs, the locket still in his hand. He raised it once to the fading sun. letting the silver catch the light before tucking it safely away. He did not know when, or if, their paths would cross again, but the canyon remembered, and so would he. The fourth night of her confinement passed with silence so thick Eleanor could almost hear her own pulse echoing against the walls. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hair unbound, her dress wrinkled from restless pacing. The shutters rattled faintly as wind pressed against them, a warning of the desert's shifting moods. She thought of Kyle constantly, of his steady hands, the way he moved with the land instead of against it. The memory was more than comfort. It was a call, pulling her back to where fear had turned to something different, something alive. She reached under her pillow, where she had hidden a strip of bedsheet she had torn carefully, knot by knot. Tonight she would use it. Tonight she would climb free. The house had quieted. Servants slept. Jonathan's heavy footsteps no longer prowled the halls. Eleanor wrapped Kyle's shirt, the one he had given her to cover her torn blouse, beneath her cloak. It still carried the faint scent of smoke and earth. She pressed it to her chest for courage, then crept to the window. With trembling fingers, she tied the strip of cloth to the iron latch and lowered it down. The fabric swayed, catching moonlight as it dangled toward the garden wall. Her breath hitched. One slip and she would fall, but the thought of staying was worse. Gathering her skirts, she swung her legs over the sill. Her descent was clumsy, the cloth biting into her palms, her body scraping against the rough adobe. But when her feet touched earth, a rush of freedom surged through her, fierce enough to draw a quiet sob from her throat. She hurried through the garden, the scent of roses mingling with dust, until she reached the far lattice, climbing the bricks. And there, in the shadows beyond the wall, he waited. Kyle stood tall, his figure half hidden by mesquite, the moonlight painting silver across his braids. For a moment, Eleanor thought he was a dream conjured from longing. But then he stepped forward, silent as the desert itself. She ran to him, breathless, barefoot, her hair whipping behind her. No words were needed. His hand closed around hers, strong and certain. Together they slipped into the night. But freedom is never given without cost. Behind them, the courtyard gates creaked open, torches flared, voices shouted. Jonathan's rage cut through the darkness like a blade. "Stop them!" Eleanor's heart lurched. Kyle pulled her close, guiding her through the brush with unerring instinct. They ran, the night alive with the pounding of boots and the crack of rifle bolts being drawn. The desert opened before them, black ridges, twisted scrub, and the endless vault of stars. Their breaths came ragged, each stride a prayer. Behind them, torchlight flickered, a swarm of fire chasing through the darkness. Kyle led her toward the ravine, his grip never loosening. When Eleanor stumbled, he steadied her. When she faltered, he pulled her forward. Then the wind shifted. A low moan rose across the land, swelling into a roar. The air thickened with grit. Eleanor glanced up and froze. A wall of sand loomed on the horizon, rolling toward them with terrible speed. The desert storm had been born without warning, as if the land itself had decided to intervene. Kyle's eyes narrowed. "Hold to me." She pressed herself against him, burying her face against his shoulder as the first gust struck. Sand stung her skin like needles. Wind howled so fiercely it drowned the shouts of their pursuers. The torches vanished, snuffed by the storm's fury. Horses screamed, men cursed, their cries scattered by the gale. Eleanor could not see, could barely breathe, but Kyle's arm was an anchor around her. Step by step, he forced a path, guiding her into a hollow between two great rocks. There he pressed her down, shielding her with his body as the storm raged. Dust filled the air, choking, relentless. The world became nothing but roar and darkness. Eleanor clutched his shirt, trembling, her cheek against the warmth of his chest. "Will they find us?" she gasped. Kyle's voice was steady even as sand whipped his braids. "The storm chooses, not them." Minutes stretched into eternity. The storm hammered the land, filling crevices, stripping branches, reshaping the very face of the desert. Yet in that chaos, Eleanor felt a strange calm. She was terrified, yes, but beneath Kyle's arm she also felt protected in a way she had never known within her father's walls. When at last the gale began to falter, silence fell heavy, broken only by the hiss of settling sand. The stars reappeared slowly, sharp and cold above the ravaged canyon. Eleanor lifted her head, her hair thick with dust, her face streaked with grit and tears. Kale rose first, scanning the horizon. Torchlight was gone. The pursuers had scattered, swallowed by the desert's wrath. Only the two of them remained. Eleanor climbed shakily to her feet, her hand still gripping his. The storm. It saved us. Kale's gaze lingered on the shifting dunes, the landscape remade before their eyes. No, he said softly. You saved yourself by choosing to run. She swallowed hard, his words striking deep. For the first time, she felt not like a prisoner fleeing, but like a woman stepping into her own strength. Side by side, they moved deeper into the wild, leaving behind the estate, the torches, and Jonathan's fury. The desert had taken its price, but given them a fragile gift a chance. And Eleanor knew with a clarity that pierced even her fear she would not waste it. The desert after the storm lay like a battlefield hushed, broken, the dunes reshaped into unfamiliar ridges. Eleanor staggered beside Kale, her skirts heavy with sand, her lungs raw from grit. Each step was an effort, but she clung to his hand as if it were the only true thing left in the shifting night. For a time, silence reigned. The stars hung low and fierce above them, and the land smelled of wet dust, bitter and sharp. It seemed as though the storm had swallowed their pursuers whole, but Kale's gaze never relaxed. His eyes searched the horizon, his ears tuned to sounds Eleanor could not hear. When the faint clatter of hooves echoed against the canyon walls, Eleanor's heart sank. Torches reappeared in the distance, their light small and scattered, but enough to pierce the dark. Jonathan Hartwell had not surrendered. He had gathered his men, pushing them on despite the storm's fury. The chase was not over. Kale led her along a narrow trail cut into the side of a cliff. The path twisted sharply, loose shale skittering beneath their boots. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps. She dared not look down. The drop below was sheer, a tumble into darkness. Behind them, voices carried, angry and relentless. Find them. Jonathan's bellow rose, strained with rage. She's mine to bring back. The words struck Eleanor like a lash. She slowed, trembling. Kale turned, his hand steady on her arm. His eyes, calm even in the flicker of torchlight, anchored her. You are not his, Kale said quietly, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Her throat tightened, tears springing hot to her eyes. She nodded, forcing her legs to move again. Step after step, they climbed. At the ridge's crest, the land opened into a shallow hollow, a pocket of shadow where boulders leaned together like ancient sentinels. Kale pressed Eleanor down behind one of the rocks, motioning for silence. They crouched low, their shoulders nearly touching, breaths quick and shallow. The pursuers drew nearer. Hooves struck stone, voices cursed in frustration. A torchlight flared, sweeping across the canyon floor like a hunting hawk. Eleanor pressed her back to the cold rock, her fingers gripping Kale's sleeve. We cannot stay here, he whispered. His breath warmed her ear, steady despite the danger. If they find us, they will not spare either of us. Her heart thundered. She nodded, though fear made her limbs heavy. Kale studied the canyon's shape, the stars, the wind. At last he pointed toward a narrow pass leading deeper into the rocks. Run when I tell you. Do not stop. What about you? She asked, her voice barely audible. I will be behind you. The words should have reassured her, but instead they cut her with dread. She knew he meant to fight if forced, to stand between her and danger as he had before. The thought of losing him so soon after finding him was unbearable. No, she whispered fiercely. You must save us both. I won't leave you. For the first time, his eyes flicked with something more than calm, something fierce, almost pained. He held her gaze, and in that silence, Eleanor felt the truth settle deep. Their fates had entwined, and there was no turning back. The shouts grew louder. Kale rose, pulling her with him. Now, he hissed. They broke from cover, sprinting through the narrow pass. Rocks scraped Eleanor's arms. Thorns tore at her skirts, but she kept pace, Kale's hand dragging her forward with relentless strength. Behind them, torches flared again, the hunters closing in. A shot cracked the night, echoing like thunder. Stone splintered near Eleanor's shoulder, showering her with grit. She stumbled, gasping, but Kale swung her up, his arm firm around her waist. He carried her across a short stretch before setting her back down. "Run," he urged, his voice harsh with urgency. And she did. They emerged into a wider ravine, the sky yawning above them. But freedom was an illusion the riders had circled, blocking the far end. Jonathan himself dismounted, his coat torn, his face streaked with dust and fury. "Enough," he roared, his revolver glinting in the firelight. "Eleanor, come to me, now!" Eleanor froze. The weight of his command pressed like iron on her chest, the same iron that had caged her for years. For a heartbeat, she almost faltered. Then Kyle stepped in front of her, his body a shield, his shoulders squared against the rifles raised toward him. His presence was immovable, like the cliffs themselves. Jonathan's voice cracked with rage. "Do you think you can keep her from me? You're nothing, less than nothing. She belongs to her name, her family, not to you." Eleanor found her voice, sharp and clear. "I belong to no one but myself." Her father's eyes widened, as if struck. The silence that followed trembled with power. Kyle's hand brushed hers, a fleeting contact but enough to ground her. She turned toward him, tears streaking the dust on her cheeks. In that moment, with danger pressing close, her heart broke open. "I would rather die here with you," she whispered, "than live another day as his prisoner." Kyle's gaze softened, the firelight catching in his eyes. He leaned close, his voice low but sure. "You will not die, not tonight." Before Jonathan could respond, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Kyle's arm wrapped around Eleanor, pulling her close. Their lips met, a kiss fierce and desperate, born not of safety but of defiance, of choosing each other even with rifles aimed at their hearts. The men shouted, startled by the suddenness of it, as if the kiss itself were rebellion enough to shake the canyon. Jonathan's voice cracked, half with fury, half with grief. "Seize them." But in that heartbeat, Eleanor no longer feared him. Whatever came, she had chosen. And Cale, silent as stone, yet burning as fire, had chosen too. The ravine pulsed with tension, the torches swaying, the rifles trembling. And in the center stood two souls bound not by walls or chains, but by something the desert itself seemed to guard, love forged in the teeth of danger. The night held its breath in the ravine. Rifles glinted in unsteady hands, torches sputtered in the wind, and Jonathan Hartwell stood trembling with a fury that seemed to drain into grief. His daughter's words, "I belong to no one but myself," still hung in the air, echoing louder than any gunshot. Kyle kept his stance, broad and immovable, Eleanor sheltered just behind his shoulder. For a moment, it seemed bloodshed was certain. Then Jonathan's revolver lowered an inch. His eyes, red-rimmed from dust and sleepless nights, searched his daughter's face. "You would throw away your family, your name, for him." His voice cracked, not with authority, but with desperation. Eleanor stepped forward, her hand still linked with Kyle's. "I am not throwing anything away. I am finding what was never given to me: freedom, respect, and love." The words, though steady, carried the tremor of years suppressed. For the first time in her life, she did not feel her father's shadow blotting her out. Jonathan's shoulders sagged. His gaze flicked to Cale, this silent man who had risked everything for a woman not his own. Pride and hatred warred in Jonathan's face, but neither won. Instead, something older, wearier, took root: resignation. He raised his hand and waved the men back. The hired guns looked uncertain, but when Jonathan barked a hoarse, "Stand down," they obeyed, lowering their rifles. No one moved for a long time. The canyon seemed to sigh, its silence deeper than before. Then Jonathan turned his back. "Go," he muttered, "but do not return. Not as my daughter." The words sliced Eleanor, but she did not waver. She squeezed Kyle's hand, her voice barely more than breath. "I will not return, not to be caged." Jonathan walked away, his figure swallowed by torchlight, the men following in uneasy silence. Only the echo of hoofbeats remained, fading into the dark. When the last sound died, Eleanor let out a shuddering sob. Cale turned to her, his hand lifting to brush the grit from her cheek. In his touch, she felt no command, no demand, only the certainty of presence. "It is finished," he said softly. She shook her head, tears streaking her face. "No, It has just begun. Days later, they traveled far from Santa Fe, keeping to old trails Kyle knew, places where rivers still whispered life into the desert. Eleanor rode beside him on a borrowed horse, her skirts ragged, her hair unpinned. She had never felt lighter. They came at last to the Gila River's bend, where the water spread wide and clear, carving green into the red earth. Cottonwoods swayed along the banks, their leaves flashing silver in the sun. The land here felt gentler, as if welcoming them. "This," Kyle said, scanning the horizon, "is good ground." Eleanor gazed at the river, her heart swelling. "Then let us make it ours." They worked side by side, building a small shelter of saplings and brush. Kyle wove the frame with sinew and skill, while Eleanor gathered wild grasses, her hands scratched but steady. At night, they slept beneath the open stars, their shoulders touching, their breaths mingling with the wind. It was not comfort as she had known it, velvet drapes, gilded halls, but something truer. Each day, Eleanor woke with dirt beneath her nails, smoke in her hair, and Kyle's quiet presence beside her. Each night, she felt less like a woman escaping and more like a woman becoming. Word of them spread slowly. Ranch hands rode past, wary eyes lingering on the odd pair, a Hartwell daughter and an Apache warrior. But when they saw the way Eleanor stood unafraid at Kyle's side, declaring in clear voice, "He is my family now," none dared challenge it. Some even tipped their hats in reluctant respect before riding on. Jonathan's shadow remained, but it no longer bound her. His power ended at the walls of Santa Fe. Out here, the land itself was witness, and the land did not lie. One evening, as the sun bled across the sky in molten orange, Eleanor carried a small wooden plank Cale had carved for her. She set it by the doorway of their new home, tracing with her fingertip the words she had inscribed herself. "This land remembers those who live by love." Kyle stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. His voice was low, reverent, "And it will remember us." Eleanor turned, pressing her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. For the first time, she felt she had crossed not only the distance from her father's estate, but the canyon of fear within herself. They stayed there as night gathered, the river whispering, the cottonwoods sighing. Stars bloomed overhead, fierce and countless, as if the sky itself leaned close to bear witness. And in that vast, silent world, Eleanor Hartwell and Cale Taza stood together, not captor and captive, not outcast and heiress, but two souls who had chosen each other against every storm, every rifle, every chain. Their story would not be written in parlor books or family ledgers. It would be etched instead into the stones, the wind, the soil that held their footsteps. A story of defiance, of freedom, of love strong enough to make even the desert remember. Every story from the frontier carries more than dust and danger. It carries truth. Eleanor's journey reminds us that freedom is never granted easily. It is claimed with courage, even when the world demands silence. And Kyle shows us that love is not loud or demanding, but steadfast, steady as stone, willing to shield another even at great cost. Together, they teach us that healing comes not from erasing the past, but from building something new upon it. Perhaps you, too, have faced moments when you had to choose between safety and freedom, between fear and love. What did you choose? And how did it shape you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched you, please give it a like, share it with someone who believes in love's quiet power, and subscribe so we can keep exploring these heartfelt tales of the Old West together.